Okay.
Good morning. Good morning. So I'm Robin Joy. I'm the research director for our state SAC. And
I'm Kara Cookson. I'm the policy director with the Vermont Center for Crime Victim Services. In Vermont, we're sort of the opposite of Arizona. We are so centralized. So my agency administers VOCA assistance, VOCA-Comp, VOCA-SAC, VIPSA, basically anything crime victim related except for CJA. And we also run our State Victim Assistance Academy.
And as the state SAC for a long time since we started, we've changed names over the years, but we have 20 some odd years worth of court data sitting on our computers, all dispositions and filings and so on and so forth. We've been very fortunate with our BJS grants to advance our technology in criminal justice. We used one BJS grant, which was instrumental here eventually to all of our criminal histories are in XML, and so we wrote a computer program to extract that into CSV so we can do very quick analysis. So thank you, BJS. And also, I'll just tell you, for those of you who've never been to our state, we found the programmer to do that on a ski slope. Yeah, that's where we find them, you know. One of our colleagues was teaching skiing, and he was teaching skiing with the guy that developed Lotus Notes, and so he donated some of his time, and we paid him public interest rates to do this for us. So we were very, very lucky. And we have done some work with the RFA filings, or relief from abuse filings under VJS in the past. But this program, for what was exciting for us, is that we were taking RFA filings into the criminal histories and then merging with victim data, which we hadn't had yet. So thank you.
Yeah. So the issue that we wanted to look at in Vermont is the issue of domestic violence. It's the leading cause of homicide in Vermont, probably the leading cause of homicide in a lot of states. And the state court system noted a trend that we were seeing a 47% increase in our DV felony filings over the past 10 years. We take that to mean that we're probably doing a better job of outreach and training, not necessarily that we've increased incidents. But that's interesting, and it's telling to us. And then meanwhile, we've been seeing a decrease in family court filings for protective orders. So we also have a really broad household member definition for domestic violence crimes and protection orders, which is good for victims in terms of trying to fit themselves into the right category. But it's really difficult for us at the center to think about trends and think about who's accessing our civil and criminal legal systems so that we as a state agency can meet them where they are. And at the center, we're able to leverage both our assistance dollars and our compensation dollars in tandem to try to accomplish that. And one of the questions, too, or issues that's very perennial for us is, should we be using some of our state compensation dollars to provide at least some compensation access for victims who aren't accessing the criminal legal system for whatever reason? And for those of you who manage a compensation program or work in a compensation program, the question of extending service is always nerve-wracking because you don't want to extend service without knowing if you have the dollars. But we also didn't want to say no before we knew what the answer was, or how to, could do some projections into what that would look like. So that's one of the primary things that we were interested in, but also just generally, what's the relationships, and we'll get into some of these things, but how can we access people where they are and find them and get them what they need with an overall goal of prevention in the end.
Just some background on why we chose the methods that we did and not the obvious NIBRS route. So we've been NIBRS compliant for 20 some odd years. But about 5-6 years ago, our largest metropolitan police departments, we all used to have one system too, which was really cool. Like everyone used the same CAT RMS system, which was brilliant. And then one of our local police chiefs in our largest city, which, by the way, is 40,000 people, is our largest city, decided he was going to come up with his own CAT RMS system. Yeah. And then other metropolitan police departments picked up on, metropolitan being, you know, relative, picked up on that. And they've been underreporting our NIBRS offenses for all of those years. There was a glitch in the computer programming that would only accept domestic violence cases if there were 2 victims. So all of our domestic violence, and for our largest municipalities, has been underreported drastically. We got a call from Senator Leahy's office, who was impressed that crime had reduced by 87%. No, sorry, sir. We did not solve the crime problem. So we, again, thanks to BJS, used our VOCA-SAC grant last year to try to rebuild the data, extracting it right from their systems to be able to rebuild and get a better crime picture. So the obvious thing here is, who's experienced domestic assault in Vermont, we would have gone to NIBRS, but we didn't. So what we did decide to do is we started with the RFA filings, our protective orders, and we started there because we're going to assume that at least at the time of filing, the people thought that a crime had been committed against them to the point that they needed help. And from there, what we did is we looked at the relationship between the civil and criminal dockets, and was there an overlap between the protection order filings and the criminal case filings. And to do that, what I did is I took the defendant's names and dates of birth from the RFA, submitted that in bulk to our criminal history repository, and extracted everyone's criminal histories. And I'll talk a little bit more about the matching that we did after. Just on a data issue, because the defendants in the RFA's cases are supplied by the victim, lots of dates of birth were missing. So out of we had 12,000 names, I'd say about 10% were missing about dates of birth, which makes it hard to match it into other systems. So it's just something we can work with the courts on, because eventually, if that order is granted, they know the date of birth because they're serving it. And then, is there a pattern that suggests victims may prefer to use one system more than the other? And then, when a protection order is granted, how many cases result in a criminal violation? And then, what categories of victims tend to access the state victims compensation fund? So far, we've answered 4 out of 5 of those.
Great job, Robin. So I jumped ahead of the application because obviously for us that's the most exciting part. So we're definitely interested in looking at best practices for referrals for our systems, especially because the relationship between the victim and offender could vary so greatly. We have a really strong child advocacy center system in Vermont, so obviously victims are going to be accessing resources there. We fund those folks. Obviously, we have a whole coalition of domestic and sexual violence programs. Victims are going to be accessing folks there. We've been doing a ton of work, at least to get a better handle on elder abuse issues in Vermont. Those have been really siloed out to other agencies, and we know, though, that elder abuse is happening, and some of it is being captured in these systems. So we want to just try to figure out where to meet people where they are. The other thing that's happened in recent years is that there was some legislation that made it easier for minors to access a protection order without a parent. And we see that in the data, actually. Yeah. We see that reflected in the data. So that says something. And I think if you look at national statistics around when dating violence tends to happen, it tends to be in younger years. So that's just interesting to us, and I think it'll also help. It'll help us to help our subgrantees. It'll help us think about how we allocate resources. It's also going to help us to make some decisions and inform our policymakers around what to do with other state compensation funds, obviously. And then there's a whole host of other policy issues that really have to do with systems and processes and the relationship between the civil and criminal systems. That's a lot of the work that I do. I just spend 6 months out of the year in the State House, and so I'm really excited to be able to take some of this data to our legislators and say, look, we need to tweak X, Y, and Z parts of our processes in order to make these systems either more accessible or what have you.
So these were some early results on the protection order docket. Our largest county, our most populous county, Chittenden County, just really didn't feel the need to enter the gender of any party ever. Just they weren't there. We've already had a meeting with our court administrator. We have a centralized court as well, so it's a statewide court, centralized court office, and we've met with our court administrator already discussing these data and implementing plans to make sure that we can kind of have some data quality checks. Our records management system for the courts is about 35 years old, hasn't caught up to some time, and even it's interesting as a data person to see the way that they think about categories of victims in these data. They are in the process of updating their courts case management system, and thankfully we have a good relationship, and the SAC is involved in saying this is what we want. And so no record of temporary and final protection orders. They just weren't entering the information, like whether it was even, like they just didn't enter whether, nothing. It was nothing. One of the problems that we alluded to in the categories here is we have categories on the victim-offender relationship, which is current spouse, former spouse, current or former household member, adult, other, and then the minor dating relationship. So intimate partners who live together but who aren't married would check the box current or former household member, but we do have a statute for domestic violence, but it also includes brother and sister, so on and so forth. So we can't tease out of that category who are intimate partner violence and who is not. Also the same thing with other, even though this docket is only supposed to be for those categories in the data, there was a lot of people who just filed against the sheriff, the post office, the federal government,
The neighbor.
the neighbor. So that stuff gets entered in, even though it'll eventually be denied because it's not. But what we found though is that in some counties, some clerks weren't directing those people to the proper docket, and so that's just something that we can work on there.
So it's, I mean, to us, we're really glad that there's an opportunity now for the courts to fix the fact that probably the most significant relationship, one of the most significant relationship categories is in with the grumpy neighbors, don't let your dog on my lawn. And we had worked on, we had used this data before for different years, and just being able to compare the years when I did some research on this in the past. Again, the minors with a past or present dating relationship, those rates are increasing, and they are the most likely to follow through to the final order. And part of me, and I'm dating myself here, is remembering those old Nike ads where if you let your daughter play sports, she was less likely to anyone else. Come on. All right, there we go. And that somehow that those were influencing, that you would be able to recognize early on that this behavior is not acceptable. Yeah, but it's still an interesting thing, especially since they don't need parental permission to file these. That these young people are still going forward to it. I will also say that this is Vermont, and I volunteer with some teens at a drop-in center in Montpelier, our state capital, and I'm not lying to you, there was a fight between students from one high school on whether you should say transgendered versus the other high school who's been taught non-binary gender. This was a discussion among teens in Vermont. So they are amazing. Amazing kids. And I'm just like, wow, you're so far ahead of where I was raised. So we took the responding party name as date of birth and sent them to VCIC for criminal records check. I took about 12,000 names. About 7,000 came back with a criminal history. This is interesting to me, somewhere in the back of my mind of what is the relationship to the application of the RFA to that person's criminal history in general. So where's that person getting that RFA in their criminal history? We are a very rural state, having worked with our criminal histories for a long time, and
requesting them from out of state and so on and so forth, we have a lot of hunting violations. There's a lot of ways you can not kill a deer properly, and people figure it out. So it just would be interesting that some other studies, some other time to look at where this RFA comes in this person's evolution of criminal history. So then we had to look for an arrest record within a few days of the temporary order being requested. And what I did here is I just kind of said, you know, because of the way the arrests work, it could be a few days after the order, right? So by the time they find him. One of the other things about being a primarily rural jurisdiction is we don't have a lot of 24-hour police coverage. And our state police shuts down at what time?
2 a.m.
Yeah, 2 a.m. is when our state police shuts down. And state police have a lot of primary coverage in our very rural areas.
50% of our state is BSC primary coverage.
Yeah. So it can take a while for them to find them, or, you know, just for the stuff that it goes through. But this was the big number. When I was able to match an appropriate arrest record with them, about 11% had an arrest within that time frame. So that's not a lot of people that are accessing the criminal justice system and the RFA system at the same time. A few caveats. We had done another study in Washington County just a few months ago where we talked with victims. And Washington County is has our state capital and another major city, and then the rest of it is all mountains and much the same. You can't get here from there. And we had a lot of victims say that they choose not to go through the RFA process because it's them. They're the ones that are antagonizing the defendant by applying for this. They instead choose to rely on the conditions of release imposed on the criminal side. So they may report it to the police, but they prefer to use the criminal conditions of release, which are, one, only as good as long as that case is active, two, does not come with the mandatory firearms. And even though our judges have the ability to remove firearms, a lot of them tend not to unless it was used in the offense. So this is a gap area that you know, victims are telling us that this is what, so finding ways to support them as they use the perhaps more protective release from abuse order. On the violation of the protection orders, and this was surprising, sort of, about 2% violated. In other words, they got an arrest for violating the temporary order, and average time to violation was about 3 days, with an average of 3 violations per incident. And about 8% violated the final order. Average time to violation was longer here, 120 days, but again, with an average of 3 violations per incident. And when I break it down by category, it's people who have shared a home together who are more likely to violate. So it was the current and former household, current and former spouse. And so that tied to property at some point in time or tied to a home was more likely. The regular other category, not so much. So that was very interesting for us.
This is also, I mean, these are charged violations. Yep. And what we hear about anecdotally from the field is that victims are reporting violations, and they're really the only people who are reporting violations. We don't have a pretrial services system that is doing some monitoring, and our law enforcement coverage is sparse, and so they're not monitoring these orders. But we do hear about violations that aren't charged anymore.
Well, these would have been at least arrested. They would have been at least arrested, yeah.
Or, I mean, we're hearing a lot of law enforcement sort of, why bother?
Or what we found in this other study where we did these victim focus groups was, especially in the rural jurisdictions, your response time can be 40 to 50 minutes, and that's if they're open, right? And so, they'll only send 2 officers out to a domestic or to an RFA, and if that guy's riding around one part of the county single, he's got to go find the other guy and respond. So, you know, it's heartbreaking to hear that I don't bother calling because I'm going to, you know, well, quite frankly, when victims says, you know, the fact that I'm not dead yet is amazing because they're just not. So they are using other ways to keep themselves safe that aren't our official response system. That's it.
Is that it?
So, yeah. So what, next up?
Yeah. So you should probably talk about what you're seeing on the compensation piece.
Sure. So We're still getting all the compensation data from Kara's shop, but just kind of looking at it, it's a lot of people aren't taking advantage of it. That when I had 1 year's worth of data, and it's hard because the way the RFA data is structured. If I file for an RFA for myself and for a child, I get 2 different docket numbers, and there's no case number, and so it's hard to figure out what a case is in the data. But yeah, not many people are accessing out of the people that are filing. So if you were to expand, it's a lot. And
if to the extent it's unreported, it's not reimbursable. Yeah, you can't get federal reimbursement, right? So that's so for us, it tells us something. You know, when our sub-grantees are saying it's really not fair that you have to make a report when, I mean, you just learned a lot about what happens when you make a report in Vermont. You know, it's not fair that you have to report until in order to access the service. You know, what we have to say is that's going to make a huge dent in our state compensation funds that aren't even federally reimbursable. So it's important information for us to have. Where we go with it, I don't know. I mean, I think like a lot of states where, you know, we really rely on traffic ticket fines and fees for victim services in our state, and you know, court fines and fees, and so there are always these avenues. I think we should be making a case for a general fund, and this might support that effort as well.
And I think next steps data-wise for us, you know, we're going to get the cost information and match all that up and give a rough estimate. But also once we are able to rebuild our NIBRs, is to look at those because, and this is great just from the partners, they actually record incident numbers in their data, which is wonderful because I can track that across all systems, from the police to the courts to Department of Corrections and to criminal histories. So once I get a list of actual domestic violence cases to see just even of those people who are eligible, how many people are taking, and is there a rural-urban distinction? What can I learn about who's able to access those compensations? Okay, that's it. Thank you.
A couple of minutes for questions. If anyone has questions for Vermont or Hawaii. I have a question for you, Amanda. It'll be interesting to see differences between enforcement agencies when you look at crime between first payment and all those other metrics. Is it your belief that your office is enforcing restitution differently than the other agencies are?
Yes. So our office, again, we're the collection point for restitution for the case of we focus a lot of work on increasing collection with share and service restitution. We've done separate analysis of that population cases, and we know that but our size of supply is much smaller than the other application or so we have statutory, we started using statutory authority to keep restitution whenever there is need for for posted approbation, and then it needs to go to stop and pay and do restitution frequently. We don't have the same type of garnishment authority. So we know that it's an entirely different process, but we also have a much bigger population of those that we expect that the collection rate will be higher. So we're in the process of learning more about what their overall procedure looks like. I was a former probation officer, so I'm curious, you know of all of the about how they allocate so like let's say someone does payment. Does that go towards the cost of supervision or does it go to court fines or like how is that restitution ranked? So restitution would be done for the we can request it
then there's also a statute that says, that general restitution by their institution or their institution from the fund. There's kind of some compensation even from which was already received about number two. And I think it's the least of the institution and it's the first money to follow after that. So restitution is number one. But I think if you're not, that's what's wrong.
Yeah, I was looking like in that kind of 14, like what effect the general economy was having on people being able to make payments. I don't know that it's advertising that was down. Depending on how the economic I would think in 2018 you could see that's maybe not covered. That's true. I think there's a variety of factors. But I think because we've had such a focused effort on restitution and state and stuff and so on, we really expect to see improve overall. And part of this effort seems to be state by state. We brought in the provided training, restitution training, everything will be not successful on these kind of restitution questions without spending money and such as making the culture. Everyone was trained, and it was fairly unified. Maybe people aren't being more than who we fund, like everybody should something. I can see them break down statewide.
I had a question for Vermont. You talked a couple of times about the fact that you're finding all of the data gaps in the court data, and they are now going to improve their records collection system. Do you think they're listening to what you're finding?
Oh, they've been, yes, they're listening, yes. We do have a strong relationship with our court administrator's office. They aren't changing their record management system because of this. It's been a process for, it's been a process for 10 years of changing their record management systems, but it's finally gone out to bid and somebody's accepted and they're now working on the nitty gritty. So, they're well aware of that. It's not just to streamline the work of the clerks, but there's a lot of end users of their data, and they are involving their end users in the discussion. What we would like to see. Yes, it was.
And I mean, I don't know, like, without Robin's expertise, like, even if we had independently pulled some of this data from judiciary, I don't know that we would have had the expertise internally to catch it. I mean, she's really the wizard, and then has that ongoing relationship. I think that helps them improve data quality. So.
Any other questions? All right, we're a little bit behind time, but let's take a short break.